Ben Harasep. I'm from the Ministry of Agriculture, Water and Land Reform. Of course, most of us have indicated that we are familiar with organic farming, and one or two indicated that the knowledge is very poor. So maybe as the introduction, I can just say that organic farming has been existing for many years. It's actually the basis of agricultural production systems in the world. If you look at in terms of where production started, it is basically in terms of whether it's a subsistence farming, whether it's a commercial farming or small-scale farmers and so on. That is basically where subsistence or where organic farming started. Basically, they started with organic farming, and that's the basis where we are here. Basically, moving from organic farming to a commercial farming, where they have then introduced the issues of fertilizers and all the other chemicals and pesticides that came into this world. What are the basic inputs in organic farming? We can talk about various inputs, which are the pesticides, which are the natural pests. We talk about organic seeds. We can talk about the compost that we can use within the organic farming system when it comes to production and so on. So I will not really amplify or empty the lecture that is supposed to be, or the lecture that is going to be done by the by one of the renowned organic farmer promoter in the world, not only in Germany but all over the world. So he has been in the industry for quite a while, and it would be good for us to tap into his knowledge. So basically, the gentleman that I'm talking about, it's called Mr. Felix Loewenstein. He has been in the industry for more than 25 years when it comes to organic farming. He has been managing the family farm in Germany for more than 25 years, and basically what then happened was when he took over the family farm, he then decided that the conventional farming is not for me. I really want to convert into the organic farming. And then in 1992, that's when he then decided to change to organic farming. Now he has been, and over these years, he has then decided, of course, I have built up experience, let me then do something, and basically he then wrote the book in 2011. Now this book basically gives us the issues of challenges, what organic farming is all about, the nitty-gritties of the cost of organic farming, and the advantages and disadvantages. So this has been the book that he wants to republish this year. Of course, with the new updates and so on. Basically looking at the food crash, that is the name of the book. The food crash. Food crash, we will have to feed ourselves ecologically or not at all. That is the name of the book.
Hello, everybody. I'm very grateful to Ben for introducing me. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to give this lecture, even though I would much rather be with you personally. But we can be happy that we have this technology at our disposal, which makes it possible for me to be thousands of kilometers away and still with you. I managed our family's farm organically for 3 decades before passing it on to the next generation. For a large part of those years, I was allowed to represent the organic food industry in Germany. politically. And in the process, and I'm sure many of you have the same experience, in almost every conversation about organic farming, the question was asked, can we feed the world like this? And that is actually the most important question we organic farmers can be asked. Do we only produce luxury goods for rich people, or is our concept suitable for the whole world? Because this is a very complex question. So I did what forces you to think through a topic intensively. I gave lectures on it. And after a while, it became a book. Despite its English title, it has only been published in German. However, it will be published by the American Acres USA publishing house and at the end of this year, and you will be able then to read it. What I want to present to you today is essentially what this book is about. What is the system of agriculture and food that can best meet one of the greatest challenges of our time? After all, hunger affects 1 in 10 people on this globe. Every night, also this night, nearly 1 billion people go to sleep with the agonizing pain of not having eaten enough and the despair of not knowing how to feed the family the next day. And with an increasing global population, there's every day new people who also want to be fed. And at the same time, more and more people in the world are eating the way it has become the standard in the countries of the north. They eat a lot of animal proteins, meat, eggs, milk. To save time from now on, I will only say meat, but I always mean all three. And then to produce this meat, we need land because we have to produce feed. And we also need land on which to produce the renewable raw materials that we need for energy, clothing, and other products of a bioeconomy that is becoming increasingly important. So we need more and more land. But this cannot be increased, at least not if we want not to plow up valuable nature conservation areas for cultivation, which we urgently need to preserve refuges for rare species. So what should we do? The answer is actually logical. We need more productivity. If we need more products and cannot increase the area, we need to achieve higher yields. And how to do that? By producing plants, ideally through genetic engineering that make higher yields possible, by applying synthetic chemical fertilizers more intensively and by using synthetic chemical pesticides to protect crops from pests. This is a compelling logic that is difficult to contradict. A short film that I once found on BASF's homepage formulates exactly this argument and ends with the call that we must now finally talk about productivity. So that is what I would also like to talk to you about today. There are 3 theses that I would like to present to you. The first is what BASF says is not true. It is not mainly about productivity when we talk about global food security. The second, this industrial system of agriculture based on chemical synthetic inputs is already not working today and will certainly not do so in the future. And third, organic agriculture has the potential to provide enough food for all people who live on this earth and who will still live there in the future. And it will do so in a way that they are fed healthily and receive maximum food sovereignty. Before I begin to justify these theses, I must make it clear that I speak very little perhaps in many places not at all about agriculture in Namibia. I had twice the privilege of being in your beautiful country and know how extensively agriculture is practiced on the vast majority of its land. However, one or two of the things I'm talking about now could also apply to the few intensive areas in your country. But even if that were not the case, this issue also has to do with you and your country. Because certainly the problems that I'm going to address, they relate to the large areas of land around the world that produce the food that you import into Namibia. So having said this, I want to justify the first thesis. To do this, we must first talk about animal foods. They are so important because when you convert plant calories to animal calories, you have to accept high conversion losses. What you see here is a chart showing how much pork, poultry, beef, milk, and eggs the residents of the United States eat on average every year. Those are the red columns. The yellow columns show how much feed is needed for that. And here is an extrapolation of this feed requirement. This is how much grain would have to be fed if all 8 billion inhabitants of this earth ate as much meat as Americans do. You don't need to remember these numbers. The only important thing is the sum. Because if that was the case, we would need 3,518 million tons of feed. So 3.5 billion tons. Unfortunately, we only produce 2.4 billion tons of wheat, maize, barley, and soybeans in the entire world. Do you understand what that means? Even if all 8 billion people were to eat only 70% of the meat consumed by Americans, every single grain of the world's grain harvest would already have ended up in the feed trough. There would be nothing left for bread, spaghetti, or muesli. Anyone who claims that there's only any conceivable form of agriculture that would make this possible is talking sheer nonsense. It is not possible. But there's also hope in this statement. And this is why. Today, 60% of the grain in the European Union and an even higher proportion in the USA is fed to animals. This means that we could free up a lot more land for growing food just by reducing meat consumption, by reducing it to the extent that the doctor orders. Because the medical scientists advise us to consume about a quarter of the average meat consumption in the USA for our health's sake. And it is by no means impossible that this reduction could happen. In Europe in particular, but also in America, meat consumption is already falling noticeably and would do so even more clearly if we were to change the economic framework conditions. But I will come to that at the very end. Even more important, a reason why increasing productivity is not the key to having enough food is the issue of food waste. In industrialized nations, studies show us that up to 20% of wheat is produced in the fields and barns, but never make it to the counter because it is thrown away first. For example, the bread that has to fill the supermarket shelves all day and is thrown away in the evening so that there is fresh bread there again the next day. And up to 30% is thrown away in households. I'm not talking about food that has gone bad, but food that could still be eaten. It is thrown away because people buy too much and don't know what our mothers still knew very well. I mean, at least my mother did. how to make very good meals from leftovers. And as you might be aware, even in developing countries with weaker economies, the relation between what is produced and what is eaten is similar. But in these cases, the reason is different. Then we talk about post-harvest losses due to poor infrastructure. I'm talking of storage and transportation, cooling. So there's no need to increase productivity as long as the real reserves lay in the field of how we handle what we produce. And this here shows why we really need to talk about something quite different from further intensification of our agricultural system. If we are to have enough land for food, for production of food in the future. Because every day, 10 million hectares disappear from agricultural production worldwide due to salinization, erosion, or other forms of degradation. Every year. That is 1/3 of what you have in Namibia in terms of agricultural land, and 12 times as much as you have in terms of arable land. We need to be so regenerative with our agricultural land that we have more fertile land in the future, instead of losing more and more of it. That, and not the increase of productivity, is decisive for whether future generations will also be able to produce enough food. Unfortunately, and this brings me to the second thesis, the system of agriculture that has become the norm in large parts of the world and is therefore called conventional no longer works anyway. Not today and certainly not in the future. Let me justify this with a few arguments, although there's a whole range of additional reasons beyond that. The first argument is that the resources needed to produce our mineral fertilizers are scarce. Fossil energy in the first place, which it takes energy which it takes to produce nitrogen. And then phosphate also is a very, very scarce. There's something wrong with my pictures here. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, let's leave it. Phosphate is lasting what we have on this earth for another 30 or maybe 300 years. That's what experts say. I mean, our farm is in our family since 500 years. So this is no acceptable horizon for a mineral that has been collected by nature over billions of years in the earth crust, in the earth history. And nitrogen, even we do not handle it in a very efficient way because almost more than half of what we bring out to our fields never reaches the plant, never goes into the plant. First path is by nitrate into the groundwater where it pollutes. We have a big problem on 34% of our surface in Germany where we cannot get clean water anymore. We have to mix it with clean water or to costly clean it to be able to put it into the pipe to have drinking water. And the second path that nitrogen takes is via surface water, and that's why we are here. Streams and rivers all the way to the oceans. There the nitrogen, together with the phosphate, acts as what it is made for. It fertilizes algae and other plant organisms in the sea, which then increase strongly. When they die, they consume a lot of oxygen and the system tips over. And this creates dead zones in which nothing lives anymore, which means that in the end there are even no more fish. The largest of these zones is the Baltic Sea, the second largest, the Gulf of Mexico, and the fourth largest, the Black Sea. And then there are all the other 500 death zones, which are shown here in black dots at the river estuaries, where the nutrients from agriculture and, of course, also from other sources arrive. No question. The agriculture that causes such problems is highly productive. It produces a lot of agricultural products, but it is not efficient enough to continue because it depletes finite resources and causes serious problems in the environment. Which brings me to my second argument. It is about biodiversity. More people understand that it is decreasing dramatically and that this is a big threat for the existence of humans on Earth, as big as climate change. Biodiversity is something like the Earth immune system. Without it, ecosystems cannot respond to changes such as those brought about by climate change. A study carried out as long as 70 years ago at a German agricultural university in Kiel shows how big a role land use plays in the reduction of biodiversity and how long this has been the case. Here, they caught ground beetles every year in wheat fields. You can see how many these were at the beginning of the project and how many after 30 years. Since then, and 1951, 81 is a long time ago, the pace has accelerated. More and more studies show how the amount of insects has decreased in the last decades. But there are still people, including farmers, who believe that this development has nothing to do with them. One farmer told me, but we wanted to produce wheat on this field and not breed beetles. Such people have not understood how ecosystems work. Because what we see here is only a very small section of entire food chains, at the end of which we humans stand. Therefore, it is not surprising if we also have to observe equally large losses in the birds of the open agricultural landscape. I guess you won't know these birds here, but in my youth, they could be found in large numbers in the fields. You can see how great the decline has been between 1990 and 2013 in the gray columns. And the red numbers below are from a recent study that shows how the losses have continued. Similar studies have been done all over the world with similar results. You may safely assume that everywhere, up to the large vertebrates on the one hand and down to the tiniest creatures in the soil and water on the other, exactly the same thing is taking place. Of course, there are many causes for this development, but you can't really say that agriculture, which cultivates a large part of the land, is not an important cause. This advertisement by the Syngenta company, which I took from an agricultural journal for farmers, makes this cynically clear. Chemical synthetic pesticides are designed to kill living things. Perhaps you know that halali is a call that hunters shout to each other when they set out to hunt. And only those who do not think can believe that killing individual organisms and the balance of ecosystems does not also affect many other organisms. And only those who are naive can claim that the chemical synthetic substances in ecosystems do not affect far more organisms than those for which they are designed. For these are substances that our ecosystems have never encountered in millions of years of their evolution. In other words, of course, these substances also are affected as a collateral damage. Here too, the following applies. An agriculture that is highly productive but damages its own production basis, that takes an axe to its own roots, cannot and must not be allowed to continue. This also applies to an agriculture that does not treat its farm animals as fellow creatures for which we bear responsibility because they are entrusted to us, but which treats them as if they were production machines. This is how it is portrayed on this agricultural magazine, even if the designer of the cover has certainly not understood what he's showing here. This is not only a problematic when thinking about animal welfare, it is also problematic because such high performance can only be achieved if the animal organism is overstrained. However, this is only possible if medication is subsequently used to ensure that the animals survive such treatment. Surely you have also heard that the most important type of medication available to us humans is in danger of losing its effectiveness because more and more resistance to it is emerging. Antibiotic resistance is not only due to the irresponsible and careless use of such medicines in human medicine, but also to their use in intensive animal husbandry. And here too, even if we obviously produce meat in such a highly productive way that it has become cheaper and cheaper compared to hourly wages, for decades, it is clear that this kind of animal husbandry can no longer continue. Not only because of the high feed consumption I have already mentioned, but also because of all the other impacts on ecosystems and on us humans. Just for the sake of completeness, I want to mention that the way we eat is also related to the way our food is produced. How we produce it in agriculture has an influence on what it costs, and that has an influence on our eating styles. Of course, the way we process food brings serious consequences for human health. This is very visibly expressed in the immense health care expenditures that have to be made for diseases that result from poor nutrition. No doubt the agriculture and food system that has become the norm in industrialized nations cannot continue in this way. This system can no longer feed the world. Therefore, and this brings me to the third of my thesis, it is good news that sustainable, ecological, organic agriculture is possible and also capable of producing enough food for all people on this planet. To understand this, it is important to realize that the problems of hunger and malnutrition are usually not, caused by a lack of food. Rather, people go hungry because they do not have access to food. This is obvious in war zones and natural disasters, but even more often people cannot afford enough food because they do not have a sufficient income. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, states that we produce over 5,000 kilocalories of food per capita per day. That is about twice as much as people need on average. A few years ago, the University of Berkeley in California conducted the largest meta study to date on the question of how conventional and organic field yields relate to each other. For this purpose, yield comparison studies were evaluated worldwide. The result was that organic farms produce 80% of what is harvested on conventional farms. This is the global average and includes both the much greater differences in intensive production areas, like in our country, and the situation in more extreme climates, where organic practices even lead to higher yields. Okay, but we surely agree that it does not help a person who is starving if we tell him that statistically there's enough for him to eat. And this is rather why we need to look at the situation of the people who are most affected by hunger in the world, and assume that you in Namibia have a very concrete idea of their situation. There are two figures that are of great importance. First, more than half of global food is produced by smallholder farmers. The definition is farmers under 2 hectares. When you know that in Asia the average farm size is 1.4 hectares, you realize why this is so. And in Africa, I think it's a bit more than 1.4. So it is the smallholder farmers who are of paramount importance for global food security. At the same time, they are the ones most affected by food shortages and hunger. 65% of all hungry people live in rural regions. What means not in the cities, which are already home to more than half of the world's population. These people all over the world have one central problem in common: debt trap. It is easy to describe. Small farmers also need cash to pay for school or for the hospital, but also to pay for agricultural inputs. They usually do not have this money, which is why they produce it, procure it from the local usurers, who lend it to them at 20% interest per month. This makes it clear who owns the harvest when it is brought in. No longer the farmer and his family, but the one to whom they have to pay back all that money. Because on top of that, these usurers are usually the ones from whom agricultural inputs are to be bought. And this is why the small farmer can no longer get out of this spiral. You find that situation in all countries of the global south. And you also found it in our country in pre-industrial times. So when it comes to the question of what kind of agriculture helps to get out of this situation, we have to look not only at the ecological effects of farming systems, as we did earlier, but also at their connection with the economic effects. What is needed, if you think about these together, is an agriculture that requires little input that you have to buy with the far too scarce money reserves and for which you go into debt. For these people, the main thing is to become self-determined, to be sovereign as far as food is concerned. Only then, when there's enough food for the family throughout the year, is it a matter for them of feeding the market. This is necessary, of course, because people who do not farm themselves also need to eat, and because the family of the small farmer does need cash money for all sorts of purposes. But this only works if the farmer's own production is so diverse that its success does not depend on one or two crops. So diversity is needed. The concept that results from these requirements is what I call ecological intensification, although I mean the same thing as organic farming. I just want to make it clear that it is not, at least not always, about certified organic farming, where the products are intended for a specialized market, but about a method of organizing your farm and running your production. It is about intensifying biological processes, photosynthesis, soil fertility, and it is about the intelligent use of natural regulatory cycles. Also, I assume that you already have a very concrete idea of this. I will use two examples to make clear what I mean by this. One example comes from the Philippines. There, the Green Revolution took place in the 1960s, during which the aim was to grow high-yielding rice varieties that required a lot of fertilizer and pesticides and water, but which were supposed to produce much higher yields than the traditional varieties. For many small farmers, however, this was a problem, because they often could not afford the inputs, because fertilizers were often not reliably supplied, because enough water was not always available, and because seeds also had to be bought at a high price. That is why they founded a community at that time called Masipak, which was about breeding on the basis of the old traditional rice varieties that still existed on some farms, and to do so in cooperation with scientific institutes. In the meantime, large quantities of adapted and resistant varieties have emerged from this. Very soon, however, it became clear to farmers that they would also have to adapt their farming systems to different criteria than those of the Green Revolution. And what emerged is exactly what I mean by ecological intensification. It's written down here. Compost and animal manure take the place of chemical synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which means that it is no longer the plant that is nourished, but the soil. It is then the fertility of the soil that continuously feeds the plants. I have already mentioned why it is a safeguard when diversity takes the place of monoculture. This diversity applies not only to the different types of crops, but also to the varieties, or in the case of livestock, to the breeds. And in this way, the pests that also trouble the small farmers are kept in check. Mixed cultures or intercropping with many different plant species, the selection of resistant varieties, but also the use of beneficial insects and homemade natural pesticides are part of this. I have been to the Philippines a couple of years ago, and I met a farmer who grew more than 90 different plants on his tiny 1.5 hectare. And he was able to describe to me in great detail which of these plants had which effect on the neighboring plants and on the health of humans and animals and on the security of the food supply. I was extremely impressed. And I understood very well from this example how knowledge intensive this kind of agriculture is. The diversity of the mixed culture also brings with it a high productivity. And this is due to the leaf area index. Surely you know this from your studies. It describes how many square meters of leaf area are per square meter of soil. It goes without saying that the more different plants grow on top of each other, the higher this index is. From the tallest tree to a bush, a low-growing plant, and a creeping plant, there's a lot of photosynthetic, oh, difficult word, photosynthetic area. And thus, what the yield of the plants is formed from. And this is the reason why this farmer, this 90 crop on 1.5 hectare farmer, produces enough food for the whole family throughout the year and enough sales routes for the market. I came across Massipac many years ago, long before I went there, in connection with a study that examined how these organic farmers had developed in comparison to their conventional colleagues on a large number of comparative farms. There were many parameters involved, from rice yield to school education, from farm income to family health. All these parameters were better on the Massipac farms. The rice yields were the same, but because the costs were much lower, the organic farms had much better incomes. I will just quote this one figure from the study here, which shows that the equity of the Massipac farms increased on average during the period studied by pretty much the same amount as the equity of the conventional comparison farm decreased. I had the opportunity to visit such farms myself in the Philippines. And there I asked a question that I'm sure you also have when I tell you this. The question, why, if it is so clear, have not all farms made this conversation long ago and not the 50,000 who did it up to now? The answers show how much complicated reality sometimes is. First of all, most farmers do not know about their economic situation because they do not keep accounts. Therefore, the most complicated task of the study was to collect the data together with the farmers in such a way that this economic situation became comprehensible. But the farmers in the Philippines are like their colleagues everywhere else. Converting to organic farming is complicated and knowledge intensive. After all, it involves much more than simply eliminating synthetic chemical pesticides and the use of artificial nitrogen fertilizers. A whole system has to be changed. This is difficult enough when you are in a relaxed economic situation, but when you are just barely getting from one day to the next, the joy of experimentation is as small as the margin for error. Farmers generally do not have the knowledge of how the new system works and how to make this transition to it. And it is not helpful if the extension service, which is rarely provided by the state, but mostly by the agricultural industry, not only does not know this either, but actively warns them not to make the switch. And then there's one last obstacle, which could be the most important in the Philippine case. In the vast majority of farms, these smallholders do not own the land that they are working on. Often it belongs to the local usurer, who not only grants the expensive loans, but as I already have said, sells pesticides and fertilizers. And now it doesn't seem very likely that he likes to see his tenant stop being his customers. So this is for the Philippines and Massipac. And now let's come to the second example that I want to use to explain what I mean by ecological intensification and the intelligent use of natural regulatory mechanisms. I shouldn't have chosen such a difficult word. So to explain this, we come now to sub-Saharan Africa, and you will probably all know it anyway. It is about the push and pull system, which addresses two problems that occur almost everywhere where maize is grown. One problem is the European corn borer, which lays its eggs in the maize stalk and whose larvae then hollow it out from the inside. The other is striga grass, a weed that attaches itself to the roots of the maize and sucks them dry. Pesticides don't really exist against either. However, it is possible to grow maize that has been genetically modified so that the plant itself produces a pesticide that kills the corn borer. Push and pull, on the other hand, solves both problems very elegantly and efficiently. You plant Desmodium to grow between the rows. This is a legume, so it fertilizes the maize with nitrogen. It covers the soil and prevents other weeds from growing. And underground, its roots secrete a substance that first causes the seeds of the striga grass to germinate, but then kills them. And above ground, Desmodium gives off the scent that is unpleasant to the corn borer and scares it away from the maize field. To make sure it really works, a fodder plant, elephant grass, is grown around the field. The corn borer thinks this is a good place to lay its eggs, which is a misjudgment. As soon as the larvae hatch, they get stuck on the sticky leaves of this plant. And that's it for him. This is rather ingenious, a solution that the ICPE in Kenya has found together with the Rothamsted Institute in England. But there is a catch to this solution. Have you noticed? No? It does not, the solution, consist of a product or a patent. So it is nothing that you can sell. The solution consists of knowledge, and that means you cannot expect Bayer or Syngenta to find such a solution, because they have to refinance their research expenses by selling products or patents. It's normal. Because this is generally not the case with innovations in organic agriculture, someone else has to finance such research. And that can be no other than the general public, which means the state. I will address this again in a moment. The fact that push and pull system not only works technically on millions of hectares by now, but also increases yields and farmers' income. This fact has long been scientifically well established. This is true for systems of agriculture, of agroecology as a whole. Concepts of agricultural development that apply methods of ecologic intensification. The German Catholic Relief Agency Miseria has evaluated examples worldwide where such methods have been applied. And I hope it is clear by now that I'm not talking about the examples where farmers did not have the money to buy pesticides and chemical fertilizers, but of those in which sophisticated agroecologic methods, sensibly coordinated with each other, are applied by well-trained women and men. How much better such systems perform can be seen in the green columns. It is, therefore, no wonder that such systems can be found all over the world and are becoming increasingly important. It is particularly exciting to observe what is happening in India, where Andhra Pradesh, already the third member state, is on its way to achieving 100% organic. There are 55 million people there, and they call the path natural farming. There just has been a study of which has been achieved so far. The title of it can be seen here, and what you can read in it is extremely encouraging. And this raises the question, before I come to the end, what actually needs to happen in order to move towards a truly sustainable, future-proof agriculture? Research is a very important lever. In other words, generating the knowledge that farmers need to be able to practice organic farming successfully. And we have already discussed that this will only happen if government budgets are made available for organic farming research. Unfortunately, this is not the case in almost any country. In Germany, it is estimated that just 4% of all public and private agricultural research funds are spent on organic farming. It goes without saying that this research only changes something if the knowledge is also transported to the farmers. Today, and I assume this also applies to Namibia, training is offered mainly by the chemical companies. And this, of course, consists on instructions on how to use their products. But what farmers need to learn is precisely to become independent of these products and to understand how a natural system works. I don't need to tell you what a huge task that is. And then I would suggest exposing organic and conventional agriculture to competition between the systems. Both systems should develop in competition with each other. I mean, both systems exist parallel to each other. And the competition is something which promotes creativity and innovation. And that is what we need to find the best future for agriculture, for our food systems. I actually do believe in that. However, there's one prerequisite for this to work. The competition must be fair. It must take place on a level playing field. And that presupposes that prices do not lie. Unfortunately, that is what they are doing at the moment. Or do you believe, after all we have discussed here, that the price tags on our often very cheap food in the supermarket speak the truth? That they reflect all the costs incurred in their production? Surely not. Neither water pollution or climate change nor the collapse of biodiversity are covered by these prices. Instead, we pay those as a general public. If we were instead to allocate all costs where they occur, then a lot would change very quickly. In France, this has been calculated. The government has calculated how much the country's waterworks spend on removing nitrate and pesticide residues from the water, because there are limits for pollution. These thresholds, these have to be met before the water can be fed onto the pipes. You have noted that 1.5 billion are spent on this every year. That's what the study says. This is paid for by the water consumers, although in reality it is the farmers who had caused it. And according to the same study, if the farmers had to get pesticides and nitrates out of the water all over the country on their own expense, I mean, not only where drinking water is produced, then that would cost 50 billion euros. And that is exactly as much as the gross value added of the entire French agriculture. How quickly do you think French farmers would switch to organic if they had to pay this actual bill? Of course, there are other levers that would lead to a transformation of agriculture. You know what they are in your country much better than I do. Then they can consist of animal welfare requirements, levies on nitrogen, pesticides, or other agricultural policy measures. What is interesting is that there's then not only a change in production methods, but also a change in consumption. It is so important to realize this, because in the discussion, it is always pretended that agricultural production methods are being changed, for example, converted to organic farming, but otherwise everything would remain the same. That this is not true, you can see in the Kingdom of Denmark, in their capital in Copenhagen. The city council decided in 2007 that all canteens for which the city is responsible should be converted to at least organic, to at least 90% organic by 2015. They actually managed to do that. In 2015, all 66,000 meals cooked in schools, kindergartens, old people's homes, homeless asylums, or in the city hall were made from 90% organic ingredients. For us here, a boundary condition set by the city council is interesting. They said it should not be more expensive, which is strange because after all, organic products cost a lot more money. I spent 3 days in Copenhagen talking to many kitchen officials and staff, and the solution to the puzzle is very simple. Spending the same amount of money despite more expensive products works because they use much less expensive meat, because they use less pre-made convenience products, more fresh ingredients, and because they have drastically reduced food waste. All this didn't happen because someone ordered it or because someone has done a lot of convincing with a raised finger, but simply as an automatic consequence of prices that speak the ecological truth. Transformations, dear friends, are possible, and we need them in agriculture and in our food system. But we must be clear, they do not succeed by themselves. They need pioneers, farmers, food processors, and traders, scientists who lead the way, who treat the path that can later become the road for us all. My appeal to you and to all the people I come into discussion with about these issues is, please become pioneers. Start making changes where you can, as customers or in the professions you learn and practice. Because one thing is very clear. Our children, the generation after us, will have to live with the consequences of how we treat nature, natural resources, and ecosystems. And they will ask us, you knew all that. You knew what kind of world would you leave to us? What was your contribution to make this a world we can live in well? We, you and I, should try to give as good an answer as possible.